I did not say a word. I did not reach across the table and take my daughter's hand the way every part of me wanted to. I sat there in that restaurant with a glass of Chardonnay. I had stopped drinking 20 minutes earlier, and I watched my son-in-law lean back in his chair like he owned the room and say, "She doesn't need to look at the menu. She always orders the same thing. I'll handle it." My daughter looked down at her plate. She was 34 years old. She had a master's degree in public health from Johns Hopkins. She had run a half marathon the previous spring and crossed that finish line with her arms in the air like she was claiming something, and she looked down at her plate. I picked up my water glass and took a slow sip, and I reminded myself of something I have told defendants from the bench for over 20 years. The moment you lose your composure is the moment you lose your power, so I did not lose mine. Her name is Isabel. She goes by Izzy, though she hated that nickname when she was 12 and asked us all to stop using it, and then somewhere around 25 she started introducing herself that way again, and I never asked why. She has her father's eyes, deep brown, the kind that look like they're holding something back even when she's laughing, and she has my stubbornness, which I did not realize until she was a teenager, and we were fighting over something I no longer remember, and I looked at her face and saw my own expression, looking back at me, and thought, oh, that's where it went. She met him at a conference in Chicago. His name is Garrett, not the Garrett in the file, a different one, and I want to be precise about that because the details matter here. He was presenting on corporate real estate development. She was there, representing the nonprofit she worked for, something about urban health equity and green spaces in low-income neighborhoods. They were, on paper, opposites. He wore a watch that cost more than my first car. She wore a lanyard with a hand-drawn cartoon of a tree on it that one of the kids from her after-school program had made her. She called me from O'Hare on her way home and she said, "Mom, I met someone." I said, "Tell me." And she did. She talked for 45 minutes while she waited for her flight. "He was charming," she said. "He was funny. He'd grown up in Charlotte but lived in Atlanta now. He had a younger sister, Brianna." She mentioned the sister early, I remember that, and a close relationship with his mother. She said he'd walked her to her gate, even though his flight was at a different terminal and he would have to go back through security. I said, "That's a good sign," and I believed it. When I said it, he called her the next day. They were long distance for 6 months, Atlanta to Baltimore, and he flew up almost every other weekend. He brought things, good coffee from a place he liked near his apartment, a book he thought she'd enjoy, once a set of seed packets because she'd mentioned wanting to try container gardening on her balcony. He remembered things. That's what she always said. He remembered things. They got engaged at the 1-year mark. She called me from the restaurant, some rooftop place downtown, and she was crying, and for one terrible second I thought something bad had happened, and then I heard the laugh underneath the tears and I breathed again. My husband, her father, he said, as long as she's happy. He was already sick by then, though we didn't know yet how sick. He died 8 months after the wedding. I think about that timing sometimes. I think about it more than I say out loud. They moved into a house in a suburb north of Atlanta. 3 bedrooms, a backyard with an oak tree, a kitchen she sent me photos of because she was proud of the light. She loved that kitchen. She said it felt like the kind of kitchen where things happen, where people gather. That was how she talked about home, as a place where people gather. It was the community organizer in her, I suppose. She always wanted to be surrounded. At first, I told myself I was projecting. Mothers do that. We look for problems because we spent so many years solving them that we don't know how to stop. I told myself that when I noticed he had strong opinions about how she loaded the dishwasher. I told myself that when he mentioned at Thanksgiving that first year that she'd overdone it with the sides and the table was a little chaotic. I told myself that when he called me, not Isabel, me, to ask if she had always been this disorganized with money because she'd bought a new coat without telling him. She was 32 years old, and she had her own income, and she bought a coat. I told myself, it's just different communication styles. It's just that they're adjusting. Marriage is an adjustment. I had been married for 31 years, and I knew that better than anyone. But there was a moment, and I want to tell you exactly what it was, because I think about it still. There was a moment when I was visiting them in Atlanta, maybe a year and a half into the marriage, and Isabel and I were sitting at the kitchen table with our coffee while he got ready for a golf game. She was telling me about a project at work, something she was excited about, a partnership with the city parks department. Her face was doing the thing it does when she's fully alive to an idea. Her hands were moving, she was leaning forward, there was color in her cheeks, and then she stopped. She actually stopped mid-sentence and looked toward the hallway where we could hear him moving around. And the color drained out of her face a little, and she said, at a much lower volume, "Actually, I don't know if it's going to happen. He thinks I should probably be looking at other opportunities anyway." I said, "What kind of other opportunities?" She said, "Something more stable, more corporate. He thinks nonprofits aren't sustainable." She said, "He thinks," where she used to say, "I think." I noticed I filed it away the way you file things you're not ready to open yet. The birthday dinner was her 34th. She had chosen the restaurant herself, a farm-to-table place in Buckhead she'd been wanting to try, the kind of place with small portions and good wine and a prix-fixe menu on Friday nights. She had made the reservation. She had been excited about it for 2 weeks. His sister came, Brianna. She was 31 and recently divorced, which I mention not to be unkind, but because it becomes relevant. She had opinions. I had noticed this at every family gathering. Opinions that arrived with the confidence of expertise she had not earned. She knew how houses should be decorated, how children should be raised, how wives should organize their time. She delivered these opinions with a warm smile that made it difficult to object without seeming ungracious. There were 6 of us: Isabel, my son-in-law, Brianna, his college friend and the friend's wife, and me. I was the only one at that table who was not one of his people. I want you to understand that. I was the visiting team. We had been seated perhaps 20 minutes when it started. It started small, the way it always does. He interrupted her twice while she was telling a story about a trip she'd taken to see a friend in Nashville. Not rudely. He was never rude in a way you could point to cleanly, but he redirected the conversation back to himself both times. And she let him. She just let him. Then the menus came. She was looking at the menu, reading it, actually reading it, because that's what you do at a restaurant you've been wanting to visit. And he said, without looking up from his own menu, "You're going to get the salmon. You always get the salmon." She said, "I was actually thinking about the duck." He said, "You don't like duck." She said, "I've had duck before. I liked it." He looked up then. He looked at her with an expression I can only describe as patient. The expression of someone explaining something for the 3rd time to someone who keeps not understanding. And he said, "And I am not going to soften this because there is no soft version of it. Sweetheart, you can't even decide what to watch on TV without asking me. You're going to trust yourself to order at a place like this?" Brianna laughed. Not a big laugh. A small, confirmatory laugh. The laugh of someone who has heard this kind of thing before and finds it charming. The college friend looked at his wife. His wife looked at her water glass. Isabel looked down at the menu. I set down my fork. I had been a family court judge in Maryland for 19 years by that point. I had presided over custody battles and termination hearings and emergency protective orders. I had looked across the bench at men who thought the courtroom was another room they could control, and I had watched that assumption leave their faces. I knew what coercive control looked like. I knew it when it was wearing a blazer and sitting at a birthday dinner and smiling like it was doing someone a favor. I also knew that if I said one word in that moment, Isabel would be the one to pay for it on the drive home. So I did not say one word. I excused myself. I said, "I need to use the restroom," and I picked up my purse and I walked to the back of the restaurant. What I actually did was stand outside the restroom for a moment and breathe. And then I made a call. Not a dramatic call. A quiet call to a colleague of mine who works in family law or jaws, someone I had known for 15 years, someone whose judgment I trusted completely. I told her where I was and what I had just seen. I told her I needed to know my options. She gave me the name of a family law attorney in Atlanta she trusted and told me to document everything going forward. That was the call. That was all. When I came back to the table, he was explaining something about commercial real estate to the college friend, and Isabel was eating her salmon. She had ordered the salmon, and she smiled at me when I sat down, a smile that was performing fine. Everything is fine. Please don't make it worse. I smiled back. I picked up my fork. I ate my dinner. After the dinner, he and the college friend went to get the cars from the valet, and for about 4 minutes it was just the women at the table. Brianna was on her phone. The college friend's wife leaned toward me very slightly and said, under her breath, "She's lucky to have you here." I didn't respond to that in the way she expected. I just said quietly, "She is." I started staying in Atlanta more. I told Isabel I liked the city, which was true. I told her I missed being close to her, which was also true. I did not tell her what I was actually doing, which was watching. I watched the way she moved through her own home, the way she asked before she made plans with friends, not as a courtesy but as a permission, the way she angled her phone screen away when she texted me, not because she was hiding anything from me, but because she had gotten used to angling her phone screen, the way she laughed at his jokes even when they weren't funny, and went quiet when his voice went a certain way, and always kept track of his mood when they were in the same room. She was not the Izzy who had crossed that finish line with her arms in the air. 3 months after the birthday dinner, I drove her to brunch. Just the two of us, a Saturday morning, a place she liked near the Beltline. We were almost back to the car when she tripped on a raised piece of sidewalk and grabbed my arm to catch herself, and her sleeve pulled up and I saw a bruise above her elbow. She pulled the sleeve down immediately. I didn't gasp. I didn't stop walking. I didn't make it a scene because I knew, and this is one of the things I understand from 20 years on the bench, I knew that the worst thing I could do in that moment was frighten her into defending him. I said, "Are you okay? Did you twist your ankle?" She said, "I'm fine, Mom, I'm fine." I said, "Okay." We walked to the car. I drove, and when I pulled up outside the house, I turned off the engine and I said, quietly, not looking at her, just looking forward out the windshield, "Isabel, I'm not asking you to tell me anything today. I'm just telling you that I see you. And whatever is happening, whenever you're ready, I am not going anywhere." She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "It's not what you think." I said, "Okay." She said, "He's under a lot of pressure at work." I said, "Okay." She said, "It was once, it won't happen again." So I said, "Okay, sweetheart." And I kept my voice level and my face neutral, and every part of me that was screaming, I kept completely still. I called my colleague back that night. I told her what I'd seen. She told me to start a private document, Dates, observations, anything I witnessed directly. She reminded me that I could not force my daughter to do anything. She told me to keep the channel open and not to let him cut me off. He tried. I should tell you that. He tried. There were comments, politely worded, always, about how Isabel needed to focus on her marriage and how outside interference made things harder for both of them. There were 2 occasions where plans he made conveniently fell on weekends. Isabel and I had already arranged to spend together. There was a Christmas where he just suggested, that maybe it would be easier if I stayed at a hotel this year rather than the guest room, and he said it with such reasonable logistics. Something about a project he was managing from home that required quiet, that I could not object without seeming like I was being difficult. I stayed at a hotel. I sent Isabel a text that said, "The hotel is lovely, my door is always open. I love you." The attorney my colleague had recommended called me first. I hadn't asked her to. She was calling as a professional courtesy to introduce herself in case I ever needed to refer anyone her way. But I told her about Isabel, and she listened, and she told me that when Isabel was ready, she would be there. 7 months after the birthday dinner, Isabel called me at 6 in the morning. I was already up. I answered on the first ring. She said, "Mom, I need to come home." I said, "I'm already packing. I drove to Atlanta that same day. I will not walk you through everything that happened in that house over the course of those hours, because some of it is Isabel's story to tell and not mine. What I will tell you is that by the end of that day, she was in my car. Her documents, her passport, her social security card, her birth certificate, a folder of financial records she had quietly assembled over the previous 6 weeks, because she had been planning this longer than she let on, were in her bag. Her clothes were in 2 suitcases in my trunk. She looked out the window the whole drive back to Maryland. I didn't push her to talk. We listened to the radio, a station that played old soul music, the kind her father liked, and at some point she reached over and turned it up a little, and I let her. The attorney handled what needed to be handled. It took the better part of 8 months. There were moments that were ugly, because there always are, and there were moments that required me to exercise a discipline I have spent my entire career developing, which is the ability to remain composed when every instinct says otherwise. He was surprised, I think genuinely surprised, that the process did not go the way he expected. I will leave it at that. What I want to tell you instead is about a Sunday morning in October, about 14 months after that birthday dinner. Isabel and I were sitting on my back porch in Baltimore. The weather had turned and we had blankets over our laps, and she was drinking her coffee with both hands wrapped around the mug, and she had paint on her wrist from a project she was working on the day before. She had started painting watercolors. She was not very good at it yet, and she knew it, and she didn't care. She said I should have listened to myself earlier. I said, "You were listening. It just took time for everything else to quiet down." She thought about that for a moment. She said, "I kept thinking I was the problem, that if I was just better at things, at managing the house, at reading him, at being what he needed, that everything would be okay." I said, "That is exactly what he needed you to think." She looked out at the backyard. I have a bird feeder I put up the previous spring, and there was a cardinal on it, the bright red of it almost absurd against the grey October sky. She watched it for a while, and she said, "Did you know from the beginning?" And I told her the truth. I said, "No, he was very careful, and I wanted it to work. I wanted it for you." She nodded. She said, "Me too." We sat there a while longer. The cardinal flew away. She got up to get more coffee and asked if I wanted a refill, and I said yes, and when she came back, she sat down a little closer to me than she had before, close enough that our blankets overlapped, and she didn't say anything about it, and neither did I. She's doing well now. She went back to the non-profit sector, a different organization, a bigger one, a role she had to turn down 2 years ago because he didn't want her taking it. She runs 3 mornings a week. She has an apartment with a friend in Baltimore, not far from me, close enough that we'd have standing Sunday plans that we cancel maybe once a month and reschedule for the following week. She went on 1 date last year, just one. She told me about it over the phone, laughing, saying the man had talked about his ex-wife for 45 minutes and she had come home and made herself pasta and watched a documentary about migratory birds, and it had been the better half of the evening. I told her there was no rush. She said, "I know, Mom. I actually know that now." I want to say something to whoever is listening to this, and I want to say it plainly, without the softness that sometimes makes these things easier to dismiss. If you are watching someone you love change, not grow, not evolve, but shrink, if you are watching them get smaller and quieter and more careful, if you are watching them look at someone else's face before they decide if their own opinion is safe to say out loud, pay attention to that. That is not a personality difference. That is not a hard season. That is someone telling you, without words, that something is wrong. You don't have to confront. You don't have to accuse. You don't have to make it a battle before they're ready to fight one. You just have to stay. You have to make yourself a constant, an anchor, a thing they can reach for when they finally get their footing. You have to be the place they know will still be there. That is what I did. I stayed. And when she was ready, she reached. I think about her father sometimes, about what he would say if he could see her now. He would probably say something quiet and certain, the way he always did. He was never a man who needed many words. He would probably just say, "There she is," and he would be right. There she is. What lesson do you carry from a story like this? And where in the world are you listening from tonight?